Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. My name is Cora Goldston from REL Midwest, and we'd like to welcome you to our webinar on supporting equity and social and emotional learning. Before we get into the webinar content, I wanted to share a few features of the Zoom webinar platform that may be helpful to you. So if we go to the next slide, you'll be able to see a few of the options in Zoom. So if you aren't already connected to audio, please click the Join Audio button in the Zoom toolbar. You'll have the option to either dial into the phone or listen through computer audio using your mic and speakers. Please click on the chat box to introduce yourself. You can share your name and organization. We really would love to know who's on the webinar today. Also, feel free to use this box if you have questions for the presenters throughout the webinar, or if you run into any technical issues, and we will work with you to troubleshoot. We also have live closed captions available during the webinar. So in order to see the captions, just click on the closed caption button that's in your toolbar. And now with that, I'm going to pass the webinar over to our moderator, Jamie Singer.
Thanks so much, Cora. Hi, everyone. This is Jamie Singer. I'm a Senior Technical Assistance Consultant with REL Midwest, and I wanted to introduce the three presenters who you'll be hearing from mostly today. You'll hear from me again toward the end. I will facilitate some of the Q&A at the end. So we have Jamila Conway Turner with us today. She's a researcher with REL Midwest as well. We also have Rose Jackson Buckley, who's the Assistant Director of Technical Assistance for the Midwest and Plains Equity Assistance Center, and Elise Belknap, who's the Early Childhood Mental Health Consultant at the Champaign County Regional Planning Commission in Illinois. I'm very excited to be joined by these three amazing presenters today, and I'm sure all of you will love hearing from them as well. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that we have three kind of buckets that we're focusing on today. Jamila will start with the research on social and emotional learning and equitable practices, and then Rose will pick up with how districts and schools can support SEL and equity, and finally Elise will talk about the Head Start practitioner experience with SEL. So we'll get three really great pieces of distinct information related to SEL and equity, and then we'll have time for some Q&A at the end. And if we go to the next slide, we will start with a question for all of you. So we'd like to make these as interactive as possible with webinars. So how do you support social and emotional development for all students? You can share your thoughts in the chat box as I go through the rest of this very brief introduction before turning it over to Jamila. But just to share a little bit about that. And then I do want to say that as the presenters are talking throughout the rest of the webinar, please feel free to write questions in the chat box. You can send them to just the panelists, or you can send them to panelists and all attendees, and then I will be going through those toward the end to do some Q&A with the presenters. So for now, how do you support social and emotional development for all students? So if we go to the next slide, you can see that REL Midwest is part of a network of 10 regional educational laboratories that's funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. So you can see the different RELs in this picture. And then if we go to the next slide, you can see that we work with school districts, state education agencies, and other education organizations in 7 states: Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, and Wisconsin. And we do this, if you go to the next slide, in partnership with practitioners and to conduct both applied research and technical support, training and coaching, as well as engagement activities with our partners. So our mission is really to support a more evidence-based education system. If you go to the next slide, you can see that we address a lot of the priorities of our states and our partners through research alliances that we have, as well as a networked improvement community. And this topic, the SEL and equity, a number of our partners across the region and nationally, as you can tell, as you see everyone introducing themselves in the chat, are really interested in improving SEL skills with young people. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Jamila Conway Turner. She'll be sharing about SEL and equity, the research about SEL and equitable practices. And Jamila will introduce herself a little bit more, but I do want to say she is a researcher with REL Midwest, and she also leads our Achievement Gap Research Alliance. I will turn it over to Jamila.
Thanks, Jamie, for that wonderful introduction and for giving us a little bit of more background about REL Midwest. So like Jamie said, my name is Jamila Conway Turner, and I am a researcher. I co-lead the Achievement Gap Research Alliance, which is the alliance that is based in Wisconsin. And then I've also done some work at AIR on SEL and equity. So if we go to the next slide, this is really what I'm going to be talking about today. I really wanted to take a step back and give everyone a little bit more information on the research on SEL before we get to the next two presenters who are going to really get into talking more about the specific practices. So this is what SEL is. So SEL is defined as the process through which children and adults understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. And there are a lot of different definitions of SEL. This is one that's coming from the Center for Academic and Social Emotional Learning, or CASEL. They have a lot of research-based resources on SEL, and there are lots of different types of SEL programs and curricula, as well as specific practices that all promote SEL. And one thing that all of these programs and practices have in common is that they all are focused on how teaching and learning happens, and also what you teach and also what students are learning. And so that's kind of the basis of what SEL is. So if we go to the next slide, these are the specific social emotional competencies that the SEL programs and practices are oftentimes really focused on. And so that's self-awareness, social awareness, responsible decision-making, self-management, and relationship skills. And these are the social emotional competencies that CASEL talks about. And I won't get into too much detail now because I know that Rose is going to be talking about these competencies a little bit later on. But for the most part, social emotional learning programs and practices, they all are really trying to target these 5 different social and emotional competencies. So if we go to the next slide, there is a lot of research on SEL. There's been decades of research that's really looked at short-term and long-term outcomes. This particular slide is really focused on the research that came from a meta-analysis that was conducted in 2011 that looked at 213 studies on SEL programs and curricula that looked at over 270,000 students. And they found that students who participated in the SEL programs had higher social and emotional competencies, better behavioral outcomes, better classroom climate, and higher academic achievement. And so there's a lot of research on both the short-term outcomes and then looking at 3 years and even beyond, looking at the benefit of social emotional learning programs as well as specific practices. And all of it is really positive, showing that it has a really positive outcomes for youth who participate in the social emotional learning programs. So if you go to the next slide. So this is a question for everyone, whether or not you're familiar with the SAFE acronym that describes the elements of effective SEL approaches. So I think that there should be a box that pops up for everyone to go ahead and answer this question. So you'll hit yes if you are familiar with this acronym, and no if you are not. And we'll give you a minute or so to answer this questions, and then I will read out what the results are. So if we go to the next slide. So this is what the SAFE acronym stands for. So we have S for sequenced and coordinated, A for active learning, F and E both really focused on really targeting explicit social and emotional competencies. And these are the particular elements that the structured SEL programs and curricula typically fall on. So can we see the results of that poll?
Hi, Jamila. We're working on launching the results. We should have them up shortly.
Okay, great. Okay, so here's the poll results now. It looks like 69% of our webinar attendees are familiar with this acronym, and about 30 are not familiar with this acronym, and about 32% are. So that's really good to know. This is research that is oftentimes cited by Castle, and it's really interesting that researchers have looked at, what is it that makes an effective program and curricula that's focused on SEL, and they have found that these 4 particular elements are one of the things that make these programs effective. And so we have, on one hand, we have the structured SEL programs and curricula, and then in addition to all of the research that has been conducted on the effectiveness of those programs, there are also researchers who are looking at specific SEL strategies and pulling out some of the specific strategies that are used in these SEL programs and that can stand alone. And so this research is coming out of Harvard with Stephanie Jones, and she has really looked at, what she calls them kernels of practice. So what are these specific kernels that are within these SEL programs that can be used as standalone practices? And so this is one of the ways that equity is starting to try to come into this conversation about SEL programs, because instead of, if programs or schools are not able to focus on a specific SEL program or curricula, that they can still implement some of these standalone practices that are still going to target the social emotional competencies, the same social emotional competencies that are targeted in the SEL programs. So if you move to the next slide. So this is kind of really leading us into where we are now, which is this intersection between SEL and equity. So there's 2 kinds of ways to think about SEL and equity, I think. So one is about access. Who has access to these SEL programs, SEL curricula, SEL practices, and really making sure that all kids can have access to SEL. And then the other kind of bucket of SEL and equity is really looking at SEL with an equity lens. And that is really more focused on how do you engage in these SEL practices with equity in mind. And so this quote is really looking at that kind of that way of thinking about SEL. And this is coming from a brief that was written by 2 AIR researchers. And so they define SEL and equity as a process whereby students and teachers build strong and respectful relationships founded on an appreciation of similarities and differences, learn to critically examine root causes of inequity, and develop collaborative solutions to community and social problems. And so in this way, they're really talking about how can we really merge those 2 buckets. So how can we say, okay, we want to implement social emotional learning practices, and we also want to make sure that we are focusing on equity. And so recognizing that those 2 things are not mutually exclusive, that you can combine them and really implement social emotional learning practices at the same time as focusing on equity. And Rose and Elise will really talk a little bit more about what that looks like in practice and how that can show up together and really marry those 2 things. So if we go to the next slide. So this is a question for you guys to think about as we are continuing on. What are some barriers that might keep teachers, adults, or schools from reaching all students and implementing high quality SEL practices. So you can go ahead and write in the chat box here some ideas that you are coming to mind there, and what barriers you might think would be really hindering being able to implement high quality SEL practices. So we'll go to the next slide, and I will read out any answers that go in the chat box right now. Implicit bias, yeah, that's definitely one big barrier here. This research is coming from a brief that was funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And this is really just pulling out 5 barriers that they talked about, although we know that there are a lot of different barriers that could be hindering high quality SEL. So we have things like educator stress and burnout, which I see coming out a lot in the chat box here. There's implicit bias, another answer that was coming through the chat box. Lack of trauma-informed school practices, exclusionary discipline practices and policies, and poverty. Lack of availability to the cost to purchase the curricula. I saw that coming through in the chat box, which is, I think, one of the reasons why that research coming out of Harvard on the kernels is really important, because it's really trying to figure out how can we do low-cost strategies that we know are going to be effective, that teachers and schools can embed in their practices, but that aren't going to be high cost or high burden on the educators. And so that, I believe, is my last slide. And so now we're going to kick it off to Rose, who's going to talk a little bit more about specific practices.
Thank you so much, Dr. Conway Turner, for that overview of SEL research. Good morning, good afternoon for some of you, depending on the time zone that you're in. My name is Rose Jackson Buckley. I am the Assistant Director of Technical Assistance at the Midwest and Plains Equity Assistance Center. Our Assistance Center supports a region of 13 states. And previously, before my role in a life a while ago, I am a former special education teacher. And as well, my PhD is in school psychology, and I've been a practicing school psychology psychologist, as well as a researcher in several different technical assistance types of environments. So today, my focus is around specific classroom practices that really come out of the research. And as Dr. Conway Turner discussed, CASEL has 5 competencies that we use as an essential guide when we think about social emotional learning in our classrooms. So we believe that CASEL's work is a wonderful framework and starting place as we think about these individual competencies. If we could go to the next slide, I just want to point out that as we think about equity and centering equity, we know that individual development isn't something that's demonstrated in isolation. So one of the things that we did at our center is just tried to reframe or think about, in addition to the competencies that CASEL includes, are to think about ways that we can really center equity. So we took a second look at these competencies in this understanding that we don't operate in a bubble, and that our social cultural framework really supports the influences of the development of these skills. So our social interactions, our personal identities, our histories are all influenced. And so how we feel, what we think, and how we behave are different depending on the various contexts and the histories of these experiences. So we took these competencies a step further. So let's talk about the first one, self-awareness. Here, CASEL's definition is very important, but we want to take this a step further as we think about how our students might recognize their feelings in our classrooms. What is it about their identities, their personal histories, maybe community practices, or other contextual components that impact those feelings, thoughts, and behaviors of our students? Sometimes I might ask myself or other practitioners, do we understand this for ourselves as adults? And how do we really promote this understanding with youth when we ask them to reflect on these things? As practitioners, do we even understand how our own identities, privileges, certain experiences influence how we perceive education, how we perceive our students and their families and caregivers, and how we come to understand learning and development of our social emotional skills? The second one, self-management. This competency is really important, and it suggests that our students should handle stress by controlling their emotions. However, I just want to add that instead of controlling emotions, we want to think about how can we really honor our students' emotions? What is it that we can do in our classroom to really support students in feeling liberated to express their emotions and opinions in a way that's constructive and healthy? It's important to think about how educators, how we, including myself and educators, how do we create those safe spaces for our students to feel comfortable and empowered to practice these skills and express themselves, when they make decisions towards self-determination. The third component of self-awareness, Castle states that we want to have healthy relationships with diverse groups. This again is really important, but we have to be careful. We want to move beyond just the recognition of diversity and maybe distancing ourselves from diversity and that we're appreciating it. But how do we really personalize this? How do we show our appreciation for differences in the spaces that we create? How are we incorporating the value of the lived experiences of our students and the multiple perspectives of others? It's one thing to be aware of difference and acknowledge that, but it means something else to really appreciate that and incorporate that into our classroom or school practices and utilize that in our learning and learning through those experiences. The fourth one of relationship building. This competency is really important to take a step further and ask ourselves, how do we establish empowering relationships with our students and our families and caregivers and community members? How do we really support that with our students and honor those assets and funds of knowledge and incorporate that into our classroom? And for the fifth one, responsive decision making. How do we allow for meaningful decision making and opportunities for students to give feedback? And really creating that space, we're providing a space for our students to also critique social norms and the status quo and think about ways that they can better benefit communities and society. So moving to the next slide. One thing I've done is really kind of combined these ideas into 5 major components, and I have resources for those components that I would like to share in the chat box that really further describe potential classroom practices. So the first one is thinking about, as a classroom practice, creating that safe space. Sometimes when we think about trauma-informed care, we can focus on individuals and neglect group experiences of trauma, or thinking about inequitable systems that might address root causes of trauma. So if we really kind of reframe this and think about how are we creating healing safe spaces is a great way to really practice that trauma-informed care with an equity lens. So you'll find in your chat box, it's really a self-assessment that you could use for the spaces that you've created, and thinking about ways that we can really build safe and inclusive schools or classrooms. So oftentimes we might think about, when we create safe spaces, the physical safety, but are we also creating conditions for intellectual, cultural, and social emotional safety and inclusiveness in our spaces? It is this environment where we're really creating the conditions for our students to utilize their skills and practice their skills. Sometimes I do hear from educators, I just don't have time. It's one more thing that I have to do. But if students aren't getting a chance to practice those skills in a safe space, we're not necessarily sure where they're providing a better place for them to practice those skills. So to better prepare them for when they walk out of our doors and face the challenges of the world, we want to think about these 4 pillars of the emotional safety, cognitive safety, and as well as intellectual and cultural safety. The next slide. When we think about classroom practices, we also are thinking about developing critical consciousness. I'm going to provide a resource in the chat box that's really helpful in thinking about how we might support the development of critical consciousness. So here, when we think about critical consciousness, we also want to think about aspects of implicit bias, and as well as things like power and privilege and how that might really impact the development of social emotional skills. So for example, I had a teacher once say that, implicit bias was really important to consider in developing social emotional skills, which I completely agree. But if we think about then power, and not all implicit bias is created equal. And we also want to think about how aspects of power might influence that bias. So if we think about, for example, perspectives on standards of beauty, and we're supporting students in developing healthy identities, talking about what those standards, the aspects of privilege and power that might surround those aspects of beauty and self-acceptance, and developing a positive self-identity might be impacted here, for example. So quickly, if we go to the next slide, I'll share also the resource here. So thinking about developing our safe spaces means that we also engage in culturally responsive practices. I provided a resource in thinking about that. So we want to think about promoting social justice through critiques of discourse, really thinking about centering and honoring cultural assets and achievements of our students. We want to think about fostering linguistic, literate, and cultural pluralism in our classroom by sustaining in-group and cross-group cultural practices. And then if we want to go to the next slide, another classroom practice to consider is developing communal practices. When we think about developing communal practices, we want to think about, in our dominant culture in the United States, much of what we do emphasizes individualism. But what are ways that we can really honor a collective space where we can co-construct meaning, co-construct knowledge, resolve conflict within our students by maybe doing circles or daily check-ins? How do we really communicate to our students that their voice is important and the knowledge that they bring into our classroom is important, as well as promoting social responsibility for our students. And finally, the next slide, when we think about effective classroom practices, we also want to think about community engagement. Are we developing partnerships with community organizations? And are we inviting community members into our space, as well as, engaging in community practices and promoting students to really understand their influence in society, and providing those opportunities for students to demonstrate altruism and supportive behaviors? I will add those resources to the chat box as well. And if you're interested in additional resources around those practices, that's something definitely I can provide. I think next we will be hearing from Elise around Head Start and SEL and equity.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me today, and for all of you in attendance for your attention on this really important topic. My name is Elise Belknap. I am the Early Childhood Mental Health Consultant for Champaign County Head Start. We serve about 600 children between the ages of about 6 weeks to 5 as we prepare them for kindergarten. This afternoon, I'm hoping to share with you our journey that we've been on for addressing equity issues in our community, in our schools, and how we have focused on social emotional learning to do that in our programming. So first, I'm going to describe to you our community and what kind of shape of inequity issues. Second, I'll describe programming and staffing design. Third, I'll describe outcomes and future goals that I hope that we work on. And lastly, I'm going to share a story about a particular kiddo that we have worked with and had success with using this model. There's more than one kid, but I can't talk about them all. So first of all, welcome to Champaign County, Illinois. We're in central Illinois. We're known for being a college town. We're home of the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. We have about 200,000 folks who live in this community. While we do have Champaign-Urbana has a metropolitan area, we're very rural. So the metropolitan area is about 34 square miles, whereas the county as a whole is 998 square miles. So that can give you a sense of, we have a really dense center, and we have a lot of communities out in our farmland as well. We're often described as micro-urban, which I think it might be code for we're a small town with crime. You'll get a sense of what that looks like and how that impacts our families in the next couple of slides. So first of all, I wanted to just touch base on equity being the kind of focus of our conversation today. At Head Start, we have performance standards, right, that prohibit the expulsion of students for behavior issues. And that's been really important for changing the conversation around behavior. But luckily, in around 2017, our governor signed a bill that prohibits the expulsion of students from preschool education and early childhood programs that are funded by our Illinois State Board of Education. And that's also gone a long way in supporting this move towards addressing the inequity around suspension and expulsion. So in our community in particular, and this might sound familiar to other communities out there, I don't know that we're special in this in any way, unfortunately, but poverty is a real issue for us. We have a higher percentage of food insecurity than Illinois on average, but that poverty is impacting families disproportionately. So 40% of our Black children in our community live in poverty in comparison to 10% of our white children. And so you can see that play out, right? And there's historical and structural reasons for that. But it is, you see the impact in the classrooms for sure. You might also find that this slide feels familiar in your community as well, right? These are the concerns of our community members: mental health, alcohol, drug abuse, gun violence, obesity, domestic violence. We have a pretty high crime rate for the size of town we are. The national median is, crime rate is 4 per 1,000 residents, and ours is 7.27. And so I want to just identify, right, that you can't address inequity and improve social emotional skills if you're ignoring the impact of trauma on our communities and more specifically on brain development, right? And that as a preschool is something that we pay a lot of attention to. So specifically our students, right, we serve around 417 of those children are living at or below the poverty line, which is part of the mission of Head Start, right? Is to serve children who are high or living it with risk. We have children who have IEPs, who are experiencing homelessness, that are involved with DCFS, and are impacted by gun violence. And this data is representative of just within this last school year, right? To date, that these are some of the issues that our kids are facing. We have children with incarcerated parents with scores in their ages and stages questionnaire, social emotional, that are above the cutoff. Children who have transient caregivers or divorced parents, children who've been exposed to domestic violence. And all of those sort of trauma factors impact not just their emotional health or behavioral health, but their physical health as well. And you can see that play out in our families and in our community. So first of all, I wanted to identify how we are looking to address that at our sites. We are really focused on promotion of social emotional learning, prevention around social emotional learning, and then intervention lastly. And we do this in a variety of ways. We are one of the primary, instead of a traditional discipline model, we practice conscious discipline, which was created by Dr. Becky Bailey. And that really focuses on promoting this understanding of the brain state model, and that if we can understand the brain and how brain handles stress, then we can adjust our interventions to match where an individual is in their brain state. So for example, if you're in your executive brain and your prefrontal lobes, you can learn, right? You can pay attention, you can focus. But when you're stressed, you're emotional, or you're in fight or flight back in your brainstem, you're not going to be able to learn from an experience, which is why these sort of traditional discipline models aren't very effective in terms of reducing behaviors in the long run. So using that frame for our teachers has been really helpful in promoting the importance of social emotional learning, switching from this paradigm of traditional discipline, the way most of us have been raised, to a discipline model that focuses on learning and empathy. So we have then used that frame to integrate sort of prevention strategies around teaching coping skills, breathing techniques, self-regulation, and creating safe places in our classrooms for children to calm down. And I think it's been really important as we build those prevention strategies that we have to learn to interpret children's behavior as communication, right? We need to understand the meaning and purpose of a child's behavior so that we can teach them how to get their needs met in a more appropriate way, right? We're honoring their feeling. We're not asking them to not feel, as Rose was describing, but we are looking to help them get their needs met in a more appropriate or in a safer way. And this has to happen before the stress reaction starts with a child when they're in their executive state of their brain. So when we get into interventions, that means that we're already at a place where the child is like escalated, they're in fight or flight, they're in an emotional state. And then our only job really can be about co-regulation, where we as an adult have to be calm in order to help that child be calm, so that way we can get them back to that executive state where they can learn from their experience. So we spend a lot of time on prevention as a primary focus, and that's been a shift for us in the last few years. So I want to also point out that you can't really you can't just do intervention, right? You have to actively teach self-regulation strategies and emotional vocabulary before the behaviors start. Otherwise, when children get upset and we only are focused on interventions, we are accidentally teaching that child that in order to get their needs met, they have to get really upset. They have to get escalated before they can get that hug that their sensory system needs or get that emotional connection. But we want them to learn how to ask for that and get what they need before the behaviors kick in. And that's been a shift, right, again, from that traditional discipline model, which all happens after the behavior. So that's really been, right, a mind shift for our staff over time. So conscious discipline, it sits within a larger model. If you're familiar with CSEPL or the pyramid model for supporting social emotional competence in infants and young children, this helps us frame the work that we do and how a child moves through the support systems that we have, so that we're not just spending all of our time up at the top of that pyramid. We're also looking at how can we make changes in the classroom so that this routine or this classroom is more conducive to supporting this child. How do we change how we relate to somebody? Does this child feel like somebody likes them and loves them in the classroom? And if not, how do we make that change? What skills, right, when you look at prevention, targeted social emotional supports, what skills does this child need to be able to be successful and meet these social emotional goals that we have for them? And what intensive interventions can be put in place across the school and family lives when we get to that very top of the pyramid? We've been lucky in that part of how we've addressed these issues at schools that we have a unique source of funding. Our mental health board has given us 2 grants. One funds my role as a social emotional development specialist, and the other funds the social skills and prevention coaches, which are mental health assistants. And we've been able to hire 3. We have 4 sites, but we have 3 that, 1 at each site, and then I operate kind of as the 4th. And these coaches function as an extension of my role to provide social emotional support and learning and parent education and referrals. And they really are that prevention as opposed to that intervention model. So you can see as this maps on in terms of our roles, that work prevention with our teachers through practice-based coaching as a strategy. All of our classrooms engage in practice-based coaching around social emotional learning. And they help with building attachment between teachers and students. And then when it comes to that second level of targeted intervention, our coaches work with teachers to identify areas of need and growth for the students and help them identify strategies for them to learn those social emotional skills. And then when it gets to the point where we're seeing persistent behaviors in the classroom that are challenging and disruptive or possibly unsafe, then it starts to involve all the stakeholders. I'm there, the coaches are there, families, teachers, family advocates, and we engage in a child study process that's really intensive. So primarily, right, things that have already been mentioned in our in the previous presentations, we're focusing on the building blocks of emotional intelligence and resilience, even right at 6 weeks to 5. These are things that we're working on. And then when it gets to the point of these more intensive interventions, it takes a lot of effort on everybody. So it really incentivizes all that prevention work. Because when we get to this point, there's functional behavioral assessments, there's assessments, the ASPSE, the DECA, we're doing ongoing data collection and observations about frequency of behavior and antecedents, behavior consequences. We're collaborating with families and we're looking to refer children for further evaluation or services. And our coaches play a really important role in kind of carrying out these strategies, doing kindergarten readiness groups, friendship groups, creating visual aid materials to support but we're using the ASPSE, the DECA, the class, and the TPOT in order to do that. We've seen improvement, but I think we're always learning, and we have a lot more to go, I think, before I'm going to be happy, I guess. So I'll say our future goals, right? We want to be trauma informed. That's our primary goal. So trauma screening for students is really important. Providing consistent reflective supervision for our staff. We need to treat our teachers as we treat our students because burnout is real, stress is real. And I wish that we had the capacity to do trauma-informed parenting classes as well. So that's a long-term goal for me. And lastly, I'll say we've had one of our children that we've had success with, right? He's experienced all the things that we had described in the previous couple of slides, right? He witnessed domestic violence. This was his very first classroom experience. He was living in a homeless shelter with his mom. And when he started the school year, he was really agitated. He was pacing, a lot of hypervigilance in the classroom. But what it looked like, right, was hitting, screaming, being unsafe in the classroom. It made it hard for him to maintain friendship with his peers and to build relationships with his teachers. So our coach worked with him, right, prevention strategies a couple times a week, helping him learn how to calm down through breathing, self-regulation strategies. The coach also worked with teachers on how to recognize, switching their mind around behaviors, seeing it as hypervigilance as opposed to a bad behavior, which changes the way you might approach him. So now when he's upset, he can use those breathing strategies. He calms himself down. He is excited to learn. We've seen incredible progress for him, and he's even generalized these skills into other environments, like when they go shopping with his mom or playing at home with his sister. So just focusing on prevention with him, we didn't even have to get to that point of intensive interventions. We saw some real improvement for him. So I know that was kind of quick and dirty, but I want to thank you for your time, and I will pass the presentation back.
Great, thank you so much to all three of you. And we do have a few questions that came in, and I was trying to keep notes. We had some people who submitted questions during the registration, so I might pull from those as well. And some of them might be geared toward more one or the other of you, and some might just be kind of open. So I think just, Elise, since you were talking most recently, one of the questions that came in ahead of the webinar, well, there were a couple questions that came in related to measurement of social and emotional learning. And one in particular, I'm wondering if you have any insight on, is particularly interested in the data used to measure social and emotional development and how you can determine equity in it. And so I'm not sure if you have any words of wisdom or if that's something that you have focused on as you've been focused on the measurement. Relatedly to measurement and assessment, another question that came in during the webinar is related to the assessments that you're using and sort of the role of those, what it should be and what it should not be when developing social and emotional skills with students and with young people. So that was a lot all rolled into one, and I think probably Jamila and Rose could weigh in as well. But Elise, do you want to take a first pass at that, and maybe in particular focused on how, if you've been able to, how you've been able to determine equity within those assessments?
Yeah, sure. I mean, inequity is a really complex issue, right? So no one assessment is going to get me there. And so I really try to use multiple lenses to view a child. So the ASQSC was at first the only thing that we were using, but it's really limited in what you can interpret, right? It's just a screening, it's not an assessment. The DECA focuses on resilience factors in a child, and so that's been a helpful addition to looking at the kiddo, and identifies very line item specific social emotional areas of growth for a kiddo, and it looks at attachment, it looks at initiative, it looks at self-regulation, and then it looks at challenging behaviors. But I also use, in a more sort of qualitative, informal approach, I use like an ecological model where I'm looking at children, I'm looking at their community, I'm looking at their family, I'm looking at their classroom. You can't just look at an individual child, or I think you can miss the equity picture, right? You have to see the context of the life that they are living in, the context of their community, and the historical barriers that they might face, and be an advocate in the face of that. So I definitely, like, I haven't found an assessment that is going to be a miracle in that sense. But if I pull back and I try to get as much, gather as much information as possible, you can get like a more holistic view of the child.
Great, thank you. I think I'll jump to another question. So Rose, when you were speaking, one of the things that you said was teachers a lot of times will say, maybe not a lot of times, sometimes, give teachers the benefit of the doubt. They're very busy. I don't have time. It's one more thing I have to do. And then that's a question that comes up when you are out in the field. It's also a question that came through when people were registering, is how do you keep teachers from feeling like this is one more thing they have to fit into their class time? And this, you know, Rose, you had mentioned it during your presentation, but really any of the presenters, panelists, if you want to weigh in here about what are recommendations or what are things that have worked for you?
Yeah, great question. You know, this is definitely one I hear a lot. So you want to think about a lot of different things, but, you know, the first thing that I would say is, as we are designing content, you know, really incorporating the development of social emotional skills within that content all the time, you know, and thinking about it not as, oh, okay, here's another thing that I want to do, but also, you know, asking yourself as you're developing content, what are some skills that I can focus on? You know, what are some of the things that are going on in my classrooms, especially if you're doing some of those morning check-in circles? What are some topics that are coming up with students? And, you know, how are you potentially infusing those in your lesson plans? I saw an example lesson plan of a teacher who, you know, was incorporating this idea of a positive body image within a second grade classroom, where she had her students draw cartoons and write sentences of dialogue between students, you know, and there was a lesson plan. There was a lesson before that final product where they were working on some standards of writing and English language arts, but also, you know, really developing some skills around positive identity, you know, what to do when you witness a bully, what are the power in words that we might use if we're describing someone as fat or skinny, or some of those, that terminology. So she really just developed those skills within that academic content. I think another thing you can do is, you know, as you're, you know, thinking about anything you do, and we're talking about equity, you know, just thinking about, you know, who has access, you know, to the content that I'm developing, you know, who's represented, you know, in the content that I'm developing, who's participating meaningfully, and really just kind of thinking about the processes that are happening within your classroom regularly to ensure equity. And really just centering it in what you're doing, versus thinking, okay, this is something in addition to, you know, my already full agenda or full plate that I have.
Great. Thank you for that. Let's see. There was another question that came in the chat. Elise, this is for you, I believe, that related to the trauma-informed parenting class. Someone had a question about how often is that class offered? How do you get parents to participate? You could share a little bit about the trauma-informed parenting class.
It's kind of, I laugh only because I wish that I was doing that class, as opposed to I have anything really concrete to share about it. It's part of a local trauma and resilience initiative that's working kind of in a more collective community focus. And it's one of the goals of that organization is to start to develop that, because it's really like it's a lack in our community. If you need parenting support or parenting help, it has to get really bad before you get access to that kind of help. Like your child has to have some kind of diagnosis or pathology that's being identified. And the only parenting program that we did have was the funding for that recently got cut. And so there isn't anything, and there needs to be. And so it's looking like we're just going to have to make it happen, right? Yeah, so I wish I had something more specific about it. Conscious Discipline has a parenting curriculum that you can look at there. I'll put the link to Conscious Discipline in the thing. So sorry, I can't be more specific.
That's all right. Thank you. Let's see, another question that came in the chat, and this is open to anyone, is do any of the presenters have comments regarding gender equity specifically? So either anything from the research or in practice that you've come across that anyone would like to share?
Hey, Jamie. Thanks for that
Hello.
question. So I don't have anything that is necessarily specific to gender equity, but I would say that a lot of times the conversation around equity is really tends to focus on racial equity. But I think that it's important to recognize that we do have lots of different subgroups that we need to be focusing on to make sure that everyone has access to SEL. And so I think a lot of the strategies that both Rose and Elise talked about really work for gender as well. And I think one of the big ones is really making sure to focus on the strengths of all particular students. So really trying to measure where can we leverage the strengths and where are there maybe weaknesses, and really combining those two things to develop specific strategies for students so that it's not so deficit focused. And so that's one particular thing that I would think of that really kind of refers to gender equity, but also all different types of equity.
Great, thank you. And it looks like one of our participants did share a link to a survey for schools and districts to capture student feedback. So this is great, and it includes gender in the assessment. Thank you so much for sharing the link to that. So there is a resource that's in the chat for people who are interested. And I think this also gets at one of the questions that was submitted ahead of time is interest in students with IEPs and English language learners. So I think to Jamila's point, and perhaps in this survey as well, that's something that we should be focusing on as well. And I would like to bring up, I think, at least one more question that was submitted ahead of time, which is, what are the most common objections to implementation? And then what are effective ways to overcome those objections? And I'm wondering, either from Elise, your perspective from being just really close to implementation and seeing what that looks like as you've been working with staff to implement this, if you have some words of wisdom. Also, Jamila and Rose, from your perspectives, just what have you seen in terms of any objections to implementation, and any helpful tips for overcoming those?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's going to be, there's always barriers to any kind of implementation. I would say our primary, I'd say one, we've had just that mindset that I was talking about before, right? A paradigm shift around how do you approach and moving away from a more punitive traditional discipline model has been really hard for people to walk away from, even though the research doesn't support it, right? Because that's how most of us were raised. So there's something in there that feels maybe uncomfortable or sort of involves some kind of shame reaction about, well, if my parents did, like, what does that mean about my parents if they did it the wrong way? I'm not totally sure, but that's a big pushback. I mean, we focus on conscious discipline, right? But we have teachers who don't always buy in to it, and so another barrier that we've come across is, and we're looking at ways to overcome this, is that kind of shotgun methods of training aren't effective. We know that's true. We can't just like scream the ABCs at a kid and expect them to know it. You have to it has to be a part of their everyday, and that's true for the adults. We need to be finding ways to help our teachers practice and provide coaching and ongoing learning. So we're looking at ways to integrate kind of a longer term teacher learning community or orientation process where we never stop training, as opposed to we do it once a year during in-service, because that's not working well for us. So that's one of the barriers that we've had, that we actually have some control over, right? Is like how we deliver the content.
Great, thank you. And that perfect timing. I think that brings us directly to the end, I did want to make sure that everyone has this information. You can follow us on Twitter for, follow REL Midwest on Twitter for the latest information, and also see our website here. I really want to thank all the presenters. If you go to the next slide, you can see how you can contact any of the presenters from the session today. I thought this was a lot of really good information, and just want to let people know that when the Zoom platform closes, there will be a pop-up for a feedback survey. We would love your feedback on what you thought about the webinar, suggestions for improvement. We're always open to that, and what you really enjoyed. Thank you so much, everyone. It was great hearing from everyone in the chat, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.